Good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Treasures of the Stained Glass repository with the well-known expert, Phil Thomas. If I could have the next slide, please. My name's David Stringer-Lamarre. I'm a member of the court of the Worshipful Company of Glaziers and Painters of Glass, and I'll be the moderator and head of the massive tech team of two people that we have here for our third webinar since 1328. So it really is groundbreaking stuff, and I'm ever so pleased that you've been able to join us here today. It is a recorded session, so hopefully we'll be able to share that with you at a later stage. You'll see at the bottom there is a chat function, and there's a couple of comments in there already. So thankfully the sound is on, which is great. I'm now going to launch the first poll for you. Here we go. Wait a moment. There we are. So this is about where you are from. The poll is launched now, so it's always great fun to hear or see actually where people are dialing in from. One of the great things, of course, now about the webinars in this virtual engagement that we have with the Glaziers is that we're able to reach so many people and actually have lots of different points of view, which is one of the great bits of any discussion, and certainly one with such an interest level this evening, as we're way over 90 people, which is terrific news here, and hopefully not too warm from where you're coming in from. Okay, I'll give you 5 seconds more. So 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I'm going to end the polling there, and I'm going to share the result with you. So we have 95% from the United Kingdom, 2% from the EU, and we've also been joined from the USA and Canada, which is great stuff indeed. Now, if you are, or if you wish, please do let us know which city you're joining us from, because obviously that says the UK or the EU in the chat functions. It's always great. So I'm here in London, 28 degrees in the shade. Let us know where you're from. Similarly, don't be shy. Let us know what kind of work you're involved with, or if you've got a company to share, do stick it in the chat, because of course it is all about engaging as well. You'll also see down by the chat function, we have the Q&A button, because we will, of course, be putting our expert under the spotlight of your opinions, as it were, via the questions, and it's a matter of voting for them. So any particular question you like, do vote to it, and then it moves it up. And then when we get around to the questions section, then I'll be able to pull them off the top, as it were. I'm now going to launch the second poll. I mean, goodness me, spoiling you this evening. Let's see, we go. Poll number 2, please, Maestro. Here we go, launch poll. Are you a member of the Worshipful Company of Glaziers and Painters of Glass? Yes, no, and you'll see our marketing team there. Not yet, because nobody really escapes. So I'll give you 5 seconds there. So 5, 4, 3, 2, and a very slow 1 as the votes are still coming in here. 84%, 86% voted, 87% voted. This is an incredibly long one. And I'm going to end the polling there, and I'm going to share the results with you now. So 57% yes, 29% no, not yet, 14%, which is great. So very much a warm welcome to people who are not members or indeed not yet members of the Worshipful Company of Glaziers and Painters of Glass. Okay, it's now my great privilege and pleasure to invite the Master Glazier, Suzanne Galloway, to address us. Master. You're on mute at the moment, Master.
Thank you, David. I'm no longer on mute, so I hope everyone can hear me. This year, because of coronavirus, we're not able to invite people to the stained glass repository at Welbeck in Nottinghamshire. This is why it's so important that we have this webinar, and we're really lucky that Phil Thomas has kindly agreed to take us through his love of 19th and 20th century stained glass using examples from the repository, which gives all of you a chance to have a look at some of the wonderful pieces that we have there. So without more ado, I think we should follow on to the running order, David.
Thank you very much, Master. So we've just had the welcome from Master Glazier, and then we're going to have the in conversation with Phil Thomas, involving myself and the Master. Then, as I've mentioned, the questions and answers session, and then closing remarks by the Master Glazier. And thank you ever so much for all the things that are going on in the chat there. I've now found out that the person from the EU is in fact from Normandy, and people are actually posting what they do, and so there's some artists involved in there, conservators, etc. But before we get straight in, we're now going to have poll number 3. Let me see, where are we, Maestro? Launch the poll. Here we are. I can see it on the screen, so that's when I turn away. I'm looking at the other monitor. So before booking a place in this webinar, had you ever heard of the stained glass repository? And don't lie, let us know, we need to have the truth. So, no, not sure. Yes, but I've never visited. Yes, and indeed I've visited the repository. You can have extra stars for that one. Okay, I'll give you another 5 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. End the polling there and share the results with you. Check my screen. There they are for you. So no, that's nice and honest. So 11% have not heard about it. So that's great. Yes, but I've never visited, 65%. And the real stars of the class there, 24%. Yes, and I've visited the repository. So Phil Thomas, this is something for you here. There's 65% and the 11. Get them down there and find out what's going on. Should this be of interest to you, which I'm sure it is. Right, let's get on with it. Let's have the in conversation with our top expert, Phil Thomas. And Master, may I ask you to lead off?
Phil, hello. I thought it would be helpful for everybody here to know, first of all, what is the stained glass repository and what exactly does it do?
Well, thank you, Master. Thank you, David. The stained glass repository is quite simply a sanctuary. It's a refuge. It's a place of safety for stained glass at risk of loss or damage. Established in 1982 with the support of the main religious denominations, because they own a lot of buildings with stained glass in, the amenity societies, the major conservation bodies, heritage organisations, and it's now on the Welbeck estate, as the Master said, in Nottinghamshire, but for many years was in a dingy cellar under Glazier's Hall. Its policy is basically to rescue stained glass of artistic value, historic merit, but it takes into consideration the state of repair and the condition of the glass, because if it's very fragmentary or likely to be impossibly expensive to relocate, it may not be worth taking into our custody. Because the job of the repository is to look after it until we can relocate it. Because we want to relocate or rehouse beautiful glass where it'll be visible and publicly appreciated. And not just in the UK. Glass has been relocated to the USA, it's been relocated to the Falkland Islands, it's been relocated all over the place. And we hope after this evening, we may get 1 or 2 more people interested in the idea of relocating it. The committee does insist on a minimum standard, well, it's quite a high standard, for the repair, for the conservation and the reinstallation of the glass by real experts. And we are a proper environmentally sound conservation organisation. We recycle everything if we can. And the repository is occasionally open to the public, but if people think they can potentially rehouse some glass, then we will open it by appointment and be very enthusiastic and welcoming.
Excellent. Thank you very much for sharing that with us. I didn't realise actually the repository shipped glass overseas. So that's great as we do engage with this international format that we do have, and good to hear about the recycling, so we can say all the ESG credentials are also being held up by the worshipful company as well. So storming. Now, what I'm interested in, Phil, what actually stimulated your own interest at the beginning in stained glass?
All my family are builders or engaged in the building trades. My father was a bricklayer. And since childhood, I've been very passionate about buildings particularly the practice of building. And spent a lot of my childhood spreading sand from the sand heap all over building sites and running along the tops of walls. And when I was young, we lived in the Northwest. I was brought up in Chester. Liverpool Metropolitan Cathedral was being built, and I think we have an image. Yep. Liverpool, Paddy's Wigwam, the Mersey Funnel, all of that. That was being built during my early teens, from when I was about 9 to 14, something like that. And my dad and I used to go over to Liverpool regularly to watch it rising and to discuss how it was being made. And one of the joys of going there was that every time we went, another panel of that wonderful John Piper stained glass that makes up the lantern there at the top of the building, another of those rectangular panels was on display on the parapet of a nearby building, so you could see it against the sky. I absolutely adored it and got terribly excited about it, and then had the enormous privilege that years later John Piper became a friend, and we actually collaborated together on the design of a couple of operas. And I remember once saying to him rather naively that I didn't like when you go through those doors in the image, you can just see a little hint of the selenium yellow plain glazing in that entrance porch. And I said to him, I thought it was ghastly, a real mistake, and that I'd heard a radio broadcast saying that it was a colour designed to repel flies, and that it clearly wasn't by him. And he roared with laughter and said, yes, it was by him, but he was now terribly embarrassed about it. And he actually tried to go into the cathedral by another entrance when he ever went there. He was a great scholar and a magpie. For example, he loved 19th century glass. So if any of you know his wonderful little window at Misterton in Nottinghamshire, it's an affectionate tribute to a 19th century window by the architect Seddon. And he and I, of course, shared a lot of enthusiasm for architecture. And one of the things I loved about John was that he saw the artistic content of the window as having its own valid, independent life, alongside and collaborating with the architecture. And I think one of the best examples of it, of course, is that sensational baptistry window at Coventry, where John's image ignores the stonework whilst being its best friend, which I think is just glorious. As an architectural historian, my particular interest is the 19th and 20th centuries, as the master said, so I've always been terribly aware of stained glass, and I've got slightly better credentials in that I have commissioned 7 modern windows, or restored old ones. I've helped make 3, I think now, and have 1 on a bench for far too long, and I design quite a lot of inscriptions for stained glass, so I've got a practical track record.
Phil, it's really good that you've given us that background, because of course there is a lot of 19th century stained glass in the repositories. So my next question for you is the 19th century revival in stained glass. What was it exactly, and why on earth did it happen?
Right. It's quite an awkward question to put a cogent answer to in the light of the repository, because the repository is an accidental collection, not a systematic one. It's what we happened to have to rescue. So making a good narrative out of it's quite difficult. And as you've got the first image there of this glass, probably by William Wales, of about late 1850s, 1860, I think, something like that. We ought to thank David Wyman of the Livery for his beautiful photographs, because most of them are by him. In the first half of the 19th century, there was a huge religious revival and a huge architectural revival, fueled by religious change, by Catholic emancipation, by an enthusiasm for antiquarianism and history, and by urban growth. Huge demand for churches in what were now very densely packed suburbs and inner cities that weren't provided with them. And of course, the cities needed public buildings. And therefore, there was a demand for the arts and crafts and skills associated with architecture. And this movement had its polemicist, had its passionate advocate, a man you will have heard of and who's coming up at the next webinar, Augustus Pugin. Pugin was one of the most passionate critics and enthusiasts and polemicists you will ever read. And he doesn't mind who he offends along the way, so it's glorious stuff to read. Pugin created the idea that the only true art for churches must be Gothic, because he thought that these islands had been at their religious peak in the Middle Ages. Consequently, any classical building, a pagan building, could not be a church as far as he was concerned. And although this is a very strange idea, mixing up architecture and religion and philosophy in that misguided way, it was hugely influential on a generation of architects who all got very passionate about it. And this is a very typical example, this little Wales panel, of Pugin-inspired early 19th century glass. It's now been rehoused, which is why I wanted to show it, because the blue borders on the sides are not original to it. And it does all the things that Pugin wanted to revive. It's no longer the painted enamelled glass of the 18th century. It's now leaded mosaic glass made up of glass that's coloured right through, or most of it is. And the colours, the lettering, the grisaille patterned background, the iconography are all absolutely typical of the early Middle Ages. And that was Pugin's ideal. And can we go on next slide? And this window, actually, this is by Hardmans of 1867, just after Pugin's death. But Pugin's most common collaborators were Hardmans of Birmingham, and indeed, eventually, he became related to them by marriage. This is absolutely typical of the sort of glazing that was produced in enormous quantities for his own churches. Again, early medieval inspired, rather innocently stylized, the vegetation, the gestures, the drapery, very appealing, really. The 14th century inspiration in the curves of the figure and in the foliage, the canopy work and so on is very apparent. And even, typical little 14th century trick, breaking into the borders. So in the left-hand light, her hand just probes into the border. In the right-hand light, Christ's cross just breaks into the border. It's a typical 14th century feature they borrow. And you might notice the faces have seemed rather faded. And it's a problem we'll come back to, the mystical word, borax. Next slide, very quickly. This is the head of that window. I love this. This is extremely typical of the decorative bits of mid-19th century stained glass. And this is what, when Victorian art was at its nadir in the 40s, 50s and 60s and 20th century, was so often swept away. They would keep the figures and what they thought the narrative bits should be and lead them up in plain glazing. And what they threw away was this, which is often gorgeous. Look how beautiful those streaky ruby glasses are. So we're pleased this one is intact. The next image, you can't discuss the 19th century in glass without some Kemp, and I can hear a lot of people groaning and a lot of people cheering because people get more passionate about him than almost anybody. This window of St. Richard is one of a series of about 5 we have in the repository. They are extremely large, but I think 4 of them are more or less completely intact. Kemp, along with Clayton and Bell, most influential studio in the 19th century, probably, deeply touched by Tractarian Anglo-Catholicism, and he effectively became the in-house artist for high Anglicans for the rest of the 19th and the early 20th century, and in many ways determined what those churches and interiors looked like. What's interesting about this is that everyone thinks a Kemp window is a Gothically inspired window, a window inspired by English glass, say, of the late 15th century or continental late 15th century glass. But in fact, he had 2 strings to his bow. He was also passionate about this kind of Renaissance glass. And he knew it because as a young man who adored St. Chad, he went to Lichfield Cathedral, which is dedicated to him, St. Chad. And there he saw the fabulous Herkenrode glazing in the Lady Chapel, which has just been conserved by past Master Barley, in fact. He was deeply touched by this glass and very moved by it, and had a strand of this Renaissance-inspired glass in his own work. Not Gothic canopy work, but a 17th century style architectural frame. Next image. Wonderful glasses, and something I think that people often don't say about Kemp was that actually it's often surprisingly luminous and pale. And people think of it as darkening church interiors, and I don't think this sort of thing does. And of course, this strand of classical glass, with these classical architectural details, very much suited to 18th century churches, to chapels, to public buildings. So he had, as it were, a secular string to his bow, and this is the sort of thing that he would provide. Very typical of Kemp, of course, the gorgeous painting of fabric, all of the jewels, the exquisite rendering of details, and some very characteristic colours, the lovely blue-grey, that sort of Fairford blue-grey in the background, and that ravishing green on St. Richard's sleeve. Should we leap on? This is curious, because I said Kemp had two idioms. This is the other one, but it's not by Kemp. This is actually Two Lights of Glass by Percy Bacon. We have 5 of them in the repository, but 2 of them have now been rehoused very successfully. And this is what most Kemp glass looks like. These late medieval canopies and bases, the wonderfully rich colours of the robes, the very varied and jolly inscription banners, the exquisite glass painting, I mean, really expert, if very old-fashioned. But interestingly, not by Kemp. These are by Percy Bacon, a rather confusing firm, very successful firm, of 2 brothers, one called Percy Charles Bacon and the other called Charles Percy Bacon, which must have led to an enormous amount of confusion at home. Immensely successful in the sort of 1880s to the 1920s. Okay.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that. I noticed, Phil, you said, Pugin said, only true art for churches must be Gothic. Was anybody actually challenging him on that, or was that taken as the view?
No, lots of people were challenging him. In fact, as early as the 1840s, there was a dictionary printed which had the verb to Puginize, to confuse architectural and religious impulses with secular and social ones. In other words, they were saying he's only defining it as religious art because it's the religious art he fancies. And he was a Catholic convert, and England was still Catholic in the Middle Ages. So it's a lot of subtext to Pugin. But of course, we talk about 19th century architecture, the battle of the styles. And there were lots of people designing marvelous buildings in other idioms, but Pugin wouldn't accept them as churches. Indeed, one of his own pupils, he went to see a church by him in Manchester, and when he came back said, it shows the folly that even decent men fall into when they get led astray. And that was because it had a round arch in it.
Crikey, there we are. Thank you very much indeed. We're already getting 2 questions in there, so for everybody, if you like those questions, do vote for them. And in the chat, just make sure it's to all panelists and attendees, so we can all see what you're talking about at the moment. So keep those comments going. It's great to see already 3 questions in there. So Phil, another one, let's get cracking. These windows are all inspired by the past. Was anyone actually making modern stained glass?
Well, a lot of people connected with the livery and who know their stained glass are going to know this straight away. The big modern radical of the 1860s onwards is William Morris. And this is a fairly typical characteristic product of the firm. And one of those, interestingly, where it's hard to decide who designed it, which is quite common. Morris, universal man, poet, book producer, novelist, conservationist, passionate socialist. He believed industrial production in the 19th century was mechanized slavery. He fought to recover crafts, arts, skills, apprenticeships. He believed in comradely guild socialism in a rather romantic way, profoundly influenced by Ruskin. He established Morris & Co. to encourage the best possible work by modern artists and to influence contemporary tastes, but had to admit in a sense it was a failure because these handmade objects were so expensive that only the people he despised and shared nothing with could afford them. And he actually said, I've spent my life pandering to the swinish luxury of the rich. Morris & Company glass, this is only one little light from the tracery of a much bigger window. Could be designed by any one of a number of people. It's hard to tell. Morris himself, who I think probably designed this. Burne-Jones, of course, who in the end, designed almost all of Morris's windows in the 1870s to the 90s. Rossetti, Philip Webb, Ford Madox Brown, and they were very firmly all in the pre-Raphaelite camp. Characteristically, extreme simplicity of design and flatness, restricted palette of colours, often very shallow backgrounds of foliage or of nothing in particular, just colour. And this is a very good example of what happened under the influence of Morris. Burne-Jones had started life designing for Powell's. When he left to join Morris at Morris & Co., this man, Henry Holliday, took over his job designing for Powell's. I think Holliday is a neglected artist, as I think Walter Crane is too, doing this sort of fabulous stuff. And what beautiful condition this is in. And the repository has two of these, a pair. Holliday, a painter, an illustrator, designer. He also was associated with the Pre-Raphaelites and influenced by them, but the work is much crisper. And he never retreats, as Burne-Jones and Morris do at the end, into a kind of chivalric, mystical never-never land. He's always much more rooted. This is a fantastically abstract little piece. The painting is broad and bold and designed to be seen at a distance. The drapery and figures are obviously influenced by Burne-Jones. The composition, a vertical figure, a horizontal figure, a diagonal figure, all framed by this wonderful circle of extremely varied ruby and blue glasses. That's a sensationally professional and elegant composition in a tiny space. I love it. I think this is really, really high-class art.
Phil, you've talked about arts and crafts with William Morris, and of course stained glass is considered both an art and a craft. So where did that go with the arts and crafts movement?
Yes, well, if we look at the next image, this is where it went. This is by far the biggest window we have in the repository, rescued from a church in Birkenhead, St. Mark's, which I knew as a child. I never went in it, but I went past it often. And as you can see, it's lost a panel bottom left. It was desperately in need of rescue. It's always going to be a nightmare to rehouse because the tracery is so particular, the stonework, and it is enormous. The figure of Christ sitting in the middle light is more or less life-size, which gives you a scary idea of the scale of the window. Thank you, that's lovely, that's exactly what I want. This window is by Christopher Whall, who was probably the most influential stained glass artist connected with the arts and crafts movement, indeed central to it, and of 20th century glass art, because he was a very influential teacher and wrote the most successful book on practical stained glass, which has been in print now continuously for over a century, I think. Remember, arts and crafts is not a style. You should not look at it through stylistic fingerprints. And when you see books in the bookshop called Arts and Crafts Style, of which there are pressingly many, throw them away, ignore them. As Dorothy Parker said, this is not a book to be tossed aside lightly, it is to be thrust from you with all the energy you can muster. There is no such thing as arts and crafts style, and they would have said that at the beginning of the 20th century. The arts and crafts is a philosophy. It's an approach to life and art. It's a series of attitudes. It's anti-academic. It's very firmly practically skill-based. It's deeply collaborative, and it's passionate about education. So academic art is the opposite of what you expect arts and crafts people to produce. Whall was profoundly against the division of labour implied by 19th century industrial processes. So he absorbed very consciously every possible aspect of the craft and the art, so that he was a sort of one-man band. Not exactly, he did actually collaborate a bit. This image is really there to give you some idea of the number of panels this window is in and the scale of it. But if we could just nip back to the previous one for a second and then we'll go on. The artistic language actually isn't a lot of advance on Edward Burne-Jones or on Morris. And it does, in fact, in many ways, occupy the same slightly hermetic, detached land of lost content world that isn't much to do with the daily grind or with anything people live through. It's about aspiration. It's an image of calm. It's hieratic. It's intensely disciplined artistically and spiritually. The glasses are sumptuously beautiful, and so is the glass painting. Although I have to say, in some ways, I find it a little limited. I think Whall's range of gestures as an artist and his extreme reluctance to let images cross from one light to another tends to give it a rather enclosed, self-contained world. But one has to admit it's ravishingly beautiful. And frankly, if I had a building tall enough, I'd be carving the tracery and begging the repository for the window. We can go on to the next one.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Phil. That was quite strong. So I'm going to talk to you about this arts and crafts. So you're saying it's not a style. In fact, you go further and say all these books, we should throw them away. And then you talk about thrusting away, etc. You said it's a philosophy or just a series of attitudes.
Oh, it is.
I presume you're saying you're right and all the books are wrong.
No, I'm not. I'm saying that all of the books, well, apart from the fact that the really intelligent ones don't call it a style. If you read the really good people, not the populist coffee table people, they will agree it isn't. It appears to be a style because at the time, in the early 20th century, magazines like The Studio, The Art Journal, Country Life were choosing selected artists and architects and certain motifs to generate a sort of notion of home and beauty that suited the Edwardian worldview. And it is that, because it's all been propagated in popular magazines in the golden age of printing, it's that has become what we think arts and crafts look like, because it's the easiest to see and find. But in fact, you can see lots of deeply eccentric work that you'd find it very hard to fit into what we think it is. And Voisey, archetypal arts and crafts architect, at the end of his life is designing full-blown Gothic buildings using revived styles. Nobody picks up a book saying arts and crafts style with a picture of Gothic buildings in. They're all supposed to have big tiled roofs that sweep down to the ground, very tall chimneys, small patterns of pretty glazing, perhaps in white or green painted window frames. And they're all supposed to be surrounded by ladies with trugs over their arm and large hats, drifting over lawns, perhaps looking like extras out of Howard's End, which in a way is the arts and crafts novel.
Excellent. Great way of putting it. And I guess a rider to that, is the kind of the arts and crafts movement, the philosophy, still alive today or still relevant?
Actually, I think it's survived a surprisingly long time. Not as a movement, not as a philosophy, but some people absorbed aspects of it and were impassioned by the desire to feel that they collaborated with other craftsmen who shared their ideals. And I would say a really great example of an arts and crafts architect in the late 20th century is the architect George Pace, designing from York wonderful churches, which are very tough and often difficult to love, but they're all made around a series of definable principles, and they include wonderful letter cutting, gilding, stone carving, beautiful joinery. Even the concrete and the steel in a building like the William Temple Church in Manchester is exquisite. You know, so I think it is still alive. And of course, its spirit infuses a lot of stained glass studios now.
Great, excellent. Thank you very much. We've got 5 questions in there. The votes are coming in, so do get involved with all that. Okay, we've seen the slide up here, Phil. So, stained glass in the 20th century. What happened next?
Next image. Well, of course, it was almost impossible for arts and crafts idealism, the concept of brotherly love, you know, alle Menschen werden Brüder, of people collaborating and being fellows and fellow guildsmen and companions. How does that survive the carnage of the trenches? Well, of course, it was almost impossible. And after 1919, stained glass takes a different direction. It either seems to retreat into sweetness, into feebleness. And we all know glass of the 20th century that, I'm afraid, this anonymous holy wallpaper when it's in churches exquisitely done and about absolutely nothing, and it doesn't move art or craft forward. It just hovers in a kind of quasi-religious hinterland. Or it became tough as old boots. And this and the next one we're going to see, but stay with this for a second. That is an example of the tough as old boots school. And I think this is a real discovery. This is by Frank O. Salisbury, 1920, and interestingly, Suzanne's predecessor as master in 1933 of the Glaziers Company. Frank O. Salisbury, not much regarded as a stained glass artist, and that's probably because he was much better regarded as something else. But this is pretty extraordinary, I think. Very unlike Christopher Whall, though much of it comes from the same stable. It's crowded, it's restless, it's gestural, it's baroque. It's not at all detached and cool as the Christopher Whall was. And actually, he trained, Frank Salisbury, as a stained glass artist in his brother's workshop, and it was always his first love, but it didn't pay enough to make him want to stick at it. And although he was hugely successful, there are only about 30 windows by him, passionate Methodist, and nearly all his windows are in Methodist chapels. Wesley's Chapel in London actually has some stunners. But if we move on, this is what he was famous for, not for being president of the USA, but he was the most successful popular portraitist between the First World War and the 1950s. And he painted thousands of them, not only in the UK, but he was hugely successful in the USA. And this Frank Salisbury portrait is still the official White House portrait of that particular president. That's the one they send you if you want a photograph. And he painted nearly all of them. He painted all the great American industrialists. He charged high fees and he got them. And he became hugely rich. But I think these are characterless, dull, thoroughly second-rate as works of art. And when you think, as a young man, his contemporaries were people like Sargent and de Laszlo, and as an old man, well, as a man in middle age, his contemporary was Augustus John, and you look at their work, and this suddenly becomes, I mean, again, a kind of wallpaper. It's anodyne and dull. And then we look at what he can do in stained glass. He can do that. Can it be by the same man? And what a comparison. And here we step into the post-arts and crafts world, thoroughly influenced still by people like Walter Crane, Henry Holliday, Sylvester Sparrow, but most of all by Frank Brangwyn. This fantastically muscular portraiture and the sense of vivid pattern making in a rather abstract way comes from Brangwyn, who, alas, I think designed far too few windows, only half a dozen. But these have much of the character of them. And the next slide. This, I mean, that's straight out of Brangwyn, isn't it? That figure, that wonderful hooded muscular figure. All of Brangwyn's mosaics and his mural paintings, like those in Skinner's Hall in London, are filled with ideas like this. And here's Salisbury, frankly, borrowing it, and very, very successfully. And the next one. You see, compared to his paintings, compared to poor old Roosevelt, this seems to me to have vivid character and the bright flat colour, the high quality glasses, the decorative invention, like all that lovely nonsense across the top, which is kind of treading water, but really nicely. And the very, very powerful effect of the leading means that this has a strong modernist streak about it. It's very fresh in a way his art isn't. And I think we've discovered somebody really special here. We need to make more of him. But to end, the next one, another of the big boys. And I thought we should finish with someone absolutely first rate. One of my complete heroes, this is Robert Anning Bell. No relation, incidentally, to the great Clayton and Bell of the 19th century. His father was a cheesemonger, not a stained glass artist. This is the wonderful Robert Anning Bell, who seems to me thoroughly grown up and intelligent and unsentimental and unfeeble and with guts and passion and also with a certain detached coolness and irony. This is very great glass, and this glass I'm included because this is a successful rehousing. It's now gone from the repository with its companion window, I think then 1927. and the two of them have now been rehoused in Gray's Inn Chapel with other fantastic early 20th century glass. This, it seems to me, is all that good 20th century glass is. It respects tradition, but it reinvents it. It's not wedded to it. It's composition, the dramatic parallel vertical lines, the superb drawing, which incidentally he never did himself. Anning Bell was a master collaborator. He always worked with other people in sculpture, in ceramics, often in paintings, in mosaics, which he did a lot, like the one on the front of Westminster Cathedral in London is fabulous and by him. He always collaborated with stained glass artists, and he would choose the colours, and his cartoons are perfectly finished, and inspect the result, but he didn't make them, which rather belies some of perhaps Christopher Whall's attitudes. And it has a slightly chunky, squared off quality that sniffs of the 1920s and 30s for me. And I think we're ending with a corker.
Excellent, fantastic, really illuminating, very well done. Loads of great comments in the chat that you won't have seen, Phil, because you've been busy concentrating and making those very articulate statements. I like the one about treading water. So we're into the questions and answers. And we've got 8 down there, loads of voting going on. People can still vote and bump those up. So as that's going on Phil, I think you've had enough of a break now, 25 seconds. We're not paying you for nothing here, so let's get on with it. But what I'd like to know, because obviously about the Glaziers, when did you join the Glaziers?
I was invited to join in 2003, the year I and my late partner actually gave the site for the Stevens competition and commissioned the window, and it's ravishing, and I see it regularly. I joined the following year in 2004 as a freeman, and embarrassingly, I didn't go to the Guildhall and become a liveryman until 2010, when another liveryman, who is known to many, she knows who she is, actually grabbed me and marched me off to the Guildhall and said, "You've waited long enough."
Oh, right. So you were dragged off. It sounds like an excellent person to have on our membership committee. Can we have the name of this person who drags people off?
Oh, I think I should save it for between ourselves.
Oh, right, okay.
Embarrass them, but she's a very well-known member of the livery.
Oh, of course. I shall mention her to Tim to get some more members dragged off indeed. Okay, terrific. Right, let's see what we've got here. But before we do that, you're a member of the Glaziers, a bit I'm interested in. We've got an audience here of non-members. Yep. What do you get out of being a member of the Glaziers, Bill?
Let's be really crude about this. Partly, I just love the idea that that one's passion and interest is acknowledged by something about oneself. You know, that this body is prepared to accept me and validate me. But the things I most like about it, well, they're a body of tremendous enthusiasts. They love nothing better than church crawling or building crawling, looking at wonderful windows or arguing about why they aren't, which is great fun. So I've made some lovely friends. At least twice a year, they go on wonderful trips and study tours, and I've been on some fantastic ones that I will never forget. Breathtakingly beautiful. And we learn a very great deal and get a lot of privileged access. And as a rather naughty aside, but it matters to me, the food is really good at Glaziers Hall. So when there's an event on, I love that.
Excellent, indeed. And that's about conviviality and the networks here within the glass people and the non-glass people as well. Right, let's get on with these questions. So number one here, Liz Wicksteed, apart from churches, were there other buildings where stained glass was common up till the 19th century or so? And does this, assuming it exists, does this also find its way to the repository? 2 questions.
It does occasionally. Of course, before the early 19th century, stained glass is a different animal. It tends to be much more enamelled and painted glass, so it doesn't have the same pattern of leading, for example. It's not a mosaic. That glass, which was once deeply disliked, is now highly prized, so it tends not to come up for the repository because people value it and look after it. And before that, in the 17th and early 18th centuries, huge quantities of armorial glass, but that again doesn't tend to come to the repository because it's often in country houses, for example, which aren't closing down and getting rid of their windows. In the 19th century, we've mostly got religious glazing. It's nearly all that in the repository, because the repository was founded at a time when lots of religious buildings were becoming redundant and closing. So it was a serious rescue operation. But in the 19th century, public buildings, town halls, absolutely stuffed with really fine stained glass. I mean, a walk around Rochdale Town Hall is an astonishing stained glass experience. It's glorious. Or Manchester Town Hall, with, I think, some of the most beautiful plain glazing I have ever seen, all designed by the architect, Waterhouse, in delicate silvers, pale greys, dark grey, deep pink, little tiny dots of yellow and blue in completely abstract patterns. Very, very beautiful indeed. And of course, town halls are stuffed with it. You know, you can think of a dozen places where there's a nice pompous portrait of a mayor in stained glass, or Queen Victoria's commemorated at her Jubilee and that sort of thing. So there's a lot of it, but it tends to be in buildings that are not under threat. So we don't get it in the repository because there's no need.
Great, thank you very much. Next one up here, historical on-glass painting can best be done with the window out of the frame on a light table. How many researchers come to the repository?
Actually, not very many. Largely, I suspect, either because although the stained glass world knows about it, I suspect people outside the stained glass world don't know it nearly well enough. And I certainly suspect scholars don't. There have been a few who've been there, and occasionally people have said they want to look at a particular window. And we'd be always extremely pleased to try and arrange time to take them there, but it doesn't happen nearly enough. And as the person who lives, I think, in terms of miles nearest to the repository, I'd probably be the fall guy who'd have to show them round. So I'm shooting myself in the foot there.
Thank you. Hopefully, here we have a quantitative one. Suzanne,
Oh,
do you want
I think
to go?
yeah, the master wants to go.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I really think we've been hiding our light under a bushel with the stained glass repository. Some of the slides that we've had this evening, it's been an eye-opener to see what's in store there, and maybe we should tell more researchers and academics about it. I think that would be a great idea.
Of course, it is quite difficult to move around and display. And as we're talking about some very big panels, it can be very awkward unless there are lots of people there to help. So swings and roundabouts really, but we'd love more people to come and see it, and we'd like more open days.
I've got a couple of quick ones then on that. Can you visit the repository in person?
You can, by appointment. Because obviously members of the repository committee have to be there to guide you and to lock up and to look after security and talk to you about the collection. But yes, it is possible. If there were enough people who wanted to come at any one time, we'd be very happy, I'm sure, for a couple of us to arrange an open day. I certainly would volunteer for that. We do usually open for 3 days in November when the Welbeck estate has its own enormous Christmas celebration, and we thoroughly take part in that. And we always get hundreds of enthusiastic people who walk away saying, I didn't know any of that. Isn't it exciting? I like stained glass. But sadly this year, Welbeck's closed because of the COVID restrictions. But next year will be bigger and better than ever. And as I said at the beginning, if you've got a building that's publicly accessible, where people can come and appreciate it, and it would accept some glass that would look good there, and you can display it beautifully, come and talk to us.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Another quick question here. How many panels or windows are there in the repository altogether?
Oh, well, our whole...
The exact one, of course.
Yes. It's 78 3/8, I think. No, the complete catalogue is available in thumbnail photographs, and sometimes even better than that, like the images you've been looking at this evening, on the repository website, which the master will give you details about later on. I think there are probably, I don't know, something like 50 or 60, either complete or, you know, panels. Sometimes we only have part of an otherwise destroyed window. because it was so important it had to be rescued, although we don't like to take bits and fragments, particularly if a window might once again be repaired and made viable in its home. But I would think, yeah, there are, probably talking 50, 60, something like that.
Great, thank you. We have a question here from Sophie. Are there any historical works by women?
We don't have any in the repository because they are so beautiful, they are always cherished by their owners. There are wonderful women stained glass artists, particularly, well, there are marvellous ones alive now. I mean, it would be easy to make a list of a dozen people who are doing really world-class work. But the very greatest women stained glass artists operating certainly in the late 19th and early 20th century, which is where we have most glass in the repository. Unfortunately, we don't have any of theirs, and I'm glad. I don't want to see the works of people, like Wilhelmina Geddes or Evie Hone, or any one of the other excellent women stained glass artists. I don't want to see their works in the repository because I want them to be loved where they are. And the repository's job is to make itself unnecessary. So leave the good women glaciers where they are.
Excellent, thank you. And we got a practical question here. Is it easy to rehouse glass, and are you contacted by interested parties?
Is it easy? Oh, it depends on a lot of parameters. How big is the glass? That Christopher Whall window, or that big circular one by Frank Salisbury, which is about 13 feet or 12 feet across. Those are extremely difficult to house because finding a context to put them in, you need a gigantic building with a gigantic wall. You need very complex support systems or stonework or ironwork. And the glass may be occasionally in a very poor state of repair. It might all be there, but it might need re-leading, or there may be other technical problems. So those things can be expensive to solve when done by the best people. Small panels are not difficult, and lots of organisations are quite keen on having them. Like the very first slide I showed, that wonderful little image of the Ascension with Jesus's feet sticking out of the cloud, which I just think is gorgeous. A thing like that is really quite easy to rehouse because it's probably only a foot wide. And windows that are less than, say, 18 inches wide are fairly easy to rehouse. But bear in mind, if they're Gothic windows, they probably have a shaped head, a trefoil or head or a cinquefoil head, and they would have to be adapted to fit in a different opening. So it's the adaptation and creating a context that's very expensive. We don't charge for the glass because we long for it to be rehoused, but we do expect a donation because it's expensive to keep the repository going.
Great, thank you very much. Lots of questions here. So do pieces tend to leave the repository more for public buildings like museums, or indeed for private collections and venues?
We don't. We would have to be very convinced to let them go to a private building, because one of our principles is that as most of this glass was made for public buildings and it has been rescued by a charitable organisation, which is the repository, that therefore we feel we have an obligation for it to remain publicly accessible. So it's not to go into private collections where its future can't be controlled and anything might happen to it. So it goes to, some has gone to public buildings, mostly it has gone back to churches, religious institutions, schools, places like that where they have the resources, they often have big enough rooms, and they have the right ethos to use it as an educational tool.
Great, thank you. There's a question here from Rachel, and it's going back to my Gothic bits. That's why I've chosen it. Wasn't one of Pugin's positions that Gothic art allowed for nuance and variation in human creativity, and therefore allowed him to reflect the divine creator rather than the slavish conventions of classical art and architecture? Question mark. Comments?
Well, yes. Yes, there is an aspect of Pugin that's that. I mean, at least one of his books, and I'm trying to remember the title of it, although it's here somewhere in the house, one of his books actually makes that point very successfully, that Gothic architecture being undogmatic about composition, it tends to be agglutinative. Gothic architecture, you add another bit, and each bit is expressed by a different roof and a different chimney. So it naturally lends itself to growth of a rather organic kind, whereas classical architecture, being canonical and rule-based and proportion-based, you tend to have to build the whole box and design the whole thing as a unity. So it's much less flexible. On the other hand, the Greeks didn't think like that. You know, look at a little building like the Erechtheion on the next to the Parthenon in Athens, a completely asymmetrical building with lots of wings and porticos added, but is still a completely homogeneous and beautiful object that obeys the rules. But yes, Pugin did think like that, because he thought Gothic architecture, as well as being morally superior and religiously and spiritually superior, also gave freedom. But 17th century architecture did exactly the same thing, but he hated that because it smelt of the Renaissance, you know, and that smelt, you could have a column somewhere and that'd be a bit pagan.
Fantastic. Thank you ever so much. Master, may I invite you to make some remarks?
Yeah, and if you just look on the screen here, you will see a picture of the last open day at the repository. We put on some demonstrations. There's Derek Hunt demonstrating glass painting. We also had the chairman of the repository, Bob Holloway, also demonstrating leading, and indeed a certain Phil Thomas, who also demonstrated lettering for stained glass as well, and some other bits and pieces. I think the two important things for me to say now are, first, of course, thank you to Phil. That's been fantastic. Thank you so much. A bit controversial here and there, but that's what we like. Thank you to David, as ever, David Stringer-Lamarre, for hosting this, and also to David Wyman, as mentioned, who produced these wonderful pictures for us to see this evening. The other thing on that screen is the link to the Stained Glass Repository website. It's been mentioned, the whole of the repository catalogue is online, plus a great deal about how the repository gets donations of glass and what you have to do if you want to see pieces of glass, and also how you apply to get it put into another building. So please look on the website there if you want to know more about the repository as a charitable foundation. And that's me done, David.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Master, for those words. Here are the various ways that we communicate with the world as an organization, and often because we have such an enormous presence out there, certainly the most successful livery company engaging in the digital space. One of the jobs is sometimes to avoid finding out about us, but if you have successfully avoided that, here are all the ways. And of course, you're already here. Do share it with your friends, families, etc. And again, there's the link for the Stained Glass repository. Now, of course, as we move into this virtual age, lots of things are now possible. For example, this, of course, and we're also now enabled, allowed, it's legal to have virtual admission ceremonies, so one doesn't have to come all the way to the city of London. So if you're not a glazier, what a strange thought. So if you're not a member of the Glaziers, of course, do look at the web link there, etc., and get in touch. We've now got people who've done their virtual admissions from overseas, including our very good friends in the USA. So lots of things are possible, and we have members in many parts of the United Kingdom, of course, but overseas, USA, South Africa, Canada, Hong Kong. Master, maybe you'd like to share some information about upcoming webinar events.
Thanks, David. I would very much. It's a really great opportunity to tell all of you that for the next webinar, we hope to have a US and UK collaboration, exhibitions and expositions, showcasing hopefully some of the work of Augustus Pugin, but also Tiffany. Now, who doesn't like Tiffany Glass? So hopefully we can do something there on Louis Comfort Tiffany. The other thing that we may have online in October, on October the 5th, is the Stevens Competition prize giving. The Stevens Competition did go ahead this year, and judging has taken place, and we hope to have an event perhaps online, where we can announce the winners on the 5th of October. So that's two things for you to look forward to. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Master Glazier, Suzanne Galloway. Thank you very much to our engaging expert, Phil Thomas. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all ever so much for joining us, and I look forward to virtually seeing you again at the next webinar. Good evening, and thank you.